Alrighty, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to today's NTAC session titled Healing Centered Reunification Investing in Community Workers with Lived Experience. My name is Cristal Ramirez, and we are so happy that you're taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items for us to go over with you. And while we're doing that, we'd love to learn more about you in the chat box if you'd like to take a minute to enter your name, organization, role, and where you're located. Next slide, please. Excuse me. As part of our session, we must provide you with this disclaimer. This presentation was prepared by NTAC under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. And while this event is supported by SAMHSA, the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the US government. Next slide, thank you. And while we hope that there aren't any security issues that happen today, if that does occur, this session will immediately end and you will be notified via email on how to rejoin a new session. Again, thank you for joining one of our NTech sessions. This is the third session in the Heartwork series. So we will have one more next week. So thank you thank you to Ebony and Will for being a part of this series. Listed on this slide are all of our incredible partners that have come together to utilize their expertise and their subject matter knowledge to help inform the field by creating products, resources, and sessions like this one to enhance to enhance the behavioral and mental health fields. Tripping over my words a little bit today. Next slide, please. Thank you. As a center, our vision is that all children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. We serve a wide cross-sector audience, including everyone from state leaders to providers to school workforce, infant and early childhood providers, community-based providers, peer supervisors, family partners, youth partners, and much more. Our services range from individual consultation to more in-depth sessions like this one, to peer learning exchanges and tools to help you. Our aim is to create outlets for communication, collaboration, and resource sharing amongst all of us. If you haven't already, please be sure to check out all of our resources and archived presentations on our website. And on the website, there's a contact us link there to request consultation or training. Here are some commonly asked questions that we get. Yes, we do provide a certificate of completion after this event. You will get that in a follow-up email as well as a copy of the presentation and get a copy of the recording for this event as well. And then eventually all of not eventually, but other archived recordings on our YouTube channel as well. If you did join by phone only, please email Joanne Bloom to report your participation. That's how you'll receive a certificate of completion. But for those joining via Zoom, or for those of you joining this way, you'll be able to get a certificate directly afterwards. Alrighty, well, now we have all the housekeeping items taken care of. I would like to welcome you again to today's session. That's part of the Heartwork series called Healing Centered Reunification, Investing in Community Workers with Lived Experience. I would like to note that as Ebony and Will are going through the session, we are going to hold the Q&A portion of this session to the end. So feel free to put it in the chat box, but it would be really helpful if y'all hold your questions until the end, and there'll be time for that. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Ebony and Will to get us started into the session.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you that are in a different time zone. I am up here in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Washington, and thank you for taking the time today to tune in on our presentation. I would like to briefly introduce I'm gonna introduce my co-facilitator. This man is a powerhouse. He is a wonderful father. He is a beautiful community member, a pillar. Nonetheless, he's just a child of God. He's amazing. And thank you, Will, for all that you've done. I always appreciated working with you on different platforms, different projects, and things like that. So today you guys are in for a special treat. And I myself, I'm Ebony Heller. That is. Okay. So today's agenda, briefly, we're just going to go over the importance of providing efficient resources, challenges folks with lived experience face without giving the proper tools to do the work, value that lived experience brings to community engagement, sacrifices of lived experience for community-based boots on ground, that's frontline workers, strategies for building professional capacity, reunification as a healing center practice, policy recommendations, and a call to action.
Great, great. Are you going to go into to your slide on the Healing Center Reunification? I want to say thank you to everyone. It's also thank you for that warm introduction. I appreciate it. And we're looking forward to, as stated, to a wonderful conversation around what Healing Center Reunification looks like, what folks with lived experience and what kind of value is brought into this space. And as stated, really getting the tools that resources how we properly manage the efforts of social welfare for every one of us. So with that, do you want to do the introduction around just the statistical support and the theory? And then I'll go in after that.
Yes, thank you for that. So just starting off with some statistics, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention reports that within 1 year of release, 55% of youth are rearrested and 24% are reincarcerated. These high recidivism rates highlight the failure of traditional reentry programs to adequately address the root causes of youth involvement in the justice system. Healing Center engagement, Dr. Sean Jim Wright, 2018, moves beyond a trauma-informed lens by recognizing the need to address systemic inequities and cultural issues that contribute to adverse experiences. This approach emphasizes the role of culture, identity, and community in supporting healing and transformation.
All right. Did you want to add anything to that? Any aspects to it?
No, unless you have something to add.
Okay. Well, I'm going to going into our slide. Here it says slide 3 for us, but I don't know what slide it is for everybody that's viewing in this particular live version. But we're going to go into the importance of lived experience, and some of the support that we have that we want to provide is the research that is provided from the Sentencing Project in 2020 suggests that individuals with lived experience, those formerly incarcerated from marginalized communities, are more effective at delivering reentry services. Studies show that formerly incarcerated people are 60% more likely to connect with and support at-risk individuals than those without lived experience. And we also want to highlight with this particular support and data, and I'm going to go on a little deeper to kind of break these things down, is the critical theory, the CRT, which emphasizes the importance of centering voices of marginalized groups, particularly those with lived experience. Their insights are crucial to understanding how systemic issues, for example, poverty, lack of access to mental health services, drive criminalization and recidivism. And so some of the things we want to kind of like highlight is how do we develop the necessary tools to be able to manage what it is that we're asking in regards to social welfare and including folks with a lived experience lens to come into this work and to provide insights that folks who are not proximate oftentimes to the problem are not as close to the solution, but oftentimes we see those folks are further removed from the resources to help out with adequate support moving these issues forward. And so we like to look at folks with lived experience doing this work with a professionalized lens. I kind of look at them in a hodgepodge of a multi different, I guess you could say, categories, right? It might go up underneath the categories lived experience, but in some aspects, they're community care providers, they're caretakers, they're community care responders, they're interventionists, and what they provide in that particular aspect is the preservation of dignity, and also restoring hope for folks in those particular communities that bring that a certain lens that if you weren't proximate to the problem, is very difficult to bring that particular lens to that issue into the space. So this goes into our next slide around the importance of lived experience and community work. So I don't want to move too fast, and if I am, please ask me to slow down. So pulling some of the data from the Vera Institute of Justice, and we'll get this data points to you guys as a follow-up as well. So data from the Vera Institute of Justice reveals that 77% of justice-involved individuals attribute their successful reentry to mentors and community workers who have walked similar paths. The concept of peer support that comes out of Davison and Chineman, Sales and Rowe, underscore how individuals with shared experiences foster trust, improve engagement, and offer practical guidance, which are key to healing and transformation. Lived experience creates a sense of relatability and hope. So the reality, when we're talking about relatability and hope, and also preserving a certain dignity, think about it from this particular lens. One of the conversations I have oftentimes in kind of leveraging what it looks like to have folks with a marginalized voice kind of leading these particular issues is when I think about if there's an issue that's impacting, say, for example, women, right? You don't want a heterosexual male or some man leading that particular issue unless women have created some kind of solution around that issue and say, hey, this is how we want you to come in to utilize maybe your privilege to be able to address these oppressive circumstances, right? Or issues. So it's the same thing when it comes to reentry, when we're talking about violence intervention, whether it's in community. These things are very important to bring folks who are proximate to the issue to be able to lead on those issues, to bring a certain insight. And this also helps to move the issue that much more further. So I'm going to hand it over to my co-collaborator here, Ebony.
Thank you so much for that, Will. I was having some issues trying to find the mute bar. So on this slide, I just want to give a little bit of backstory before I share some personal experience with you. So this is talking about the sacrifices of folks with lived experience. So a report from Health Resources and Services Administration highlights that 63% of community workers with lived experience report high levels of burnout and emotional fatigue, particularly due to mental and emotional strain of supporting others while managing their own trauma. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that individuals must meet their own basic needs, mental well-being, financial stability, before effectively supporting others. Workers with lived experience often face the challenge of rebuilding their own lives while simultaneously helping others. Now, this speaks directly to my experience, right? So when I began the process of just finding my way, what works for me, a lot of times there was no blueprint, there was no instructions or anything. So sometimes I had to make decisions based off of what I knew I wasn't going to do based on the results it could render. So a lot of times I didn't know what I could do until I started to experience different things that might work for me. So that's including going to school, getting higher education, but at the same time, since I was independent from so early in life, I also had to have income in order to provide the cost of living for myself. With that being said, by just being impacted through the systems and things like that, just seeing folks in the community that look like me, it was hard to just overlook and be like, oh, I just have to figure out what works for me and do my thing. It's in my core that reach one, each one, reach one, teach one. Just like the Sankofa bird, don't forget where you come from, but reach back and pull somebody forward with you, things like that. So it was really hard to not help other people and also prioritize myself, because at the time, minimum wage is not what it is now. So working 7 days a week, and enrolled in apprenticeship full time, working on my bachelor's program full-time, all these things simultaneously while still keeping a presence in the community. So oftentimes I had late night, early mornings, balancing a couple hours of sleep, completely burned out. But I knew that I couldn't quit because it wasn't just me that was dependent on the response. This is also impacting my community, those that come behind me. A lot of these programs that exist today, they didn't exist back then. A lot of these are, particularly in Seattle, are influenced by us who came through with the lived experience that saw a need that wasn't there, a resource that wasn't there, and was able to create some type of program to satisfy that need. Next slide.
Thank you for that. So as we go into slide, what looks like 15 for you guys, the reunification of a healing center practice. We're going to talk about strategies for building professional capacity. As Ebony kind of, talked about, there's burnout. There weren't a lot of different resources available, doing this work. And then you feel like you're starting over. But the reality is, oftentimes we don't understand that this work has a lot of history, a lot of historical context attached to it. When there's approaches around violence intervention strategies in the public health sector, oftentimes we don't mention that these things were influenced by a lot of folks that were proximate to that problem or to those issues. A Black woman in particular, Black men in particular, helped to revolutionize these particular concepts, from David Satcher to John Rich, folks of that nature. And so when we don't understand these nexus points, we oftentimes find ourselves starting over. And so now we have these new theories in terms of practice, in terms of how those theories or words are systematized. So you got to understand, it's like putting a word into a search engine. It's systematized at a prompt. If you start, like, for example, if you go to Google, you put MI, it is already probably going to think you're probably putting in maybe Michael or something of that sort. It's prompted, right? So when we use that terminology, lived experience, we oftentimes are moving off of information that seems like it's just starting right now, right? And so when we're talking about that burnout, that's because most folks with lived experience are coming into this work feeling like there's no document, there's no historical context in terms of monuments. So therefore, there's no opportunity for true capacity to be developed on a professional level when there truly is, right? But that's part of us utilizing our lived experience and our professional to show, like, hey, there's folks who with lived experience been doing this work for quite some time. They may have been looked at in a different way in terms of their practice, right? So when I think about even local folks like Larry Gossett, for example, he might be someone we could say with lived experience, not necessarily impacted by the system, but someone who's proximate and someone who can bring in a value perspective, right? So with that, we're talking about strategies for building professional capacity. So a 2019 Brookings Institute study found that investments in training, certification, and mental health supports for community workers resulted in a 30% increase in worker retention and a 50% improvement in service delivery outcomes. Also, we looked at this theory and paired it up with the social learning theory, what Bandura in 1977 suggests that community workers learn best when supported with appropriate resources, training, and mentorship. This theory emphasizes that professional growth is enhanced when workers can observe, imitate, and receive feedback within supportive environment. There are certain things that we know that come out of certain groups when they caucus amongst themselves. There are certain, situations or things that they can look at and professionalize in terms of his work. One of the things I think about in terms of proximity, when we talk about even in the nature of this, let's say, for example, looking at things through the lens of public health from lived experience. I don't know if you guys can kind of, like, by the show of hands, this virtual thing throws me off a little bit because I'm like a more interactive person. I like to be in space with folks and kind of feel the energy. I'm not, this AI thing is a little different for me. But with that being stated, I'm gonna try to do my best to be as personal through this particular platform. That feels a little impersonal for me. But for the sake of, if you guys can use your some of your emojis or whatever, do you guys agree that ambulance services in this society is something that's needed? By the show of hands. Okay, looks like we got most of you guys in agreement that this particular service is in need. Now I'm going to ask you guys another question. Did you guys know that the ambulance service, the way that we see it, the way that is used to support the social welfare and well-being of Americans, did you know that that came through Black folks, that came through Black Americans? And keep your hands raised if you didn't know that, and please break your hands down if you didn't know that. And I want you to understand the Freedom. Have you guys ever heard of the Freedom House ambulance service? Keep your hands up if you have. I try to keep a little crowd participation going. So the Freedom House ambulance service, it comprised of Black people, Black men and Black women in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who seen a need, a social responsibility to respond to their community in a way that was, that was going to be beneficial, right? And it became a public health need that actually was taken it became systematized in terms of this practice. And because of that, we now have folks who are able to receive quality care resources right away because of this invention. But it's hard to get these things if you don't got folks who are proximate to the problem that can bring this particular insight and also bring this particular resource. So I wanted to highlight these things as far as a value, as far as with people with lived experience, when they're proximate to an issue, they're able to bring a certain insight into that issue. And we'll get to some other different key contributors as well. But this is just in the practice of when we're talking about building up the professional capacity, is folks need to understand when we highlight these things, it didn't just start, with somebody just getting out of prison or someone giving up their nexus or their connection maybe to a subculture, but the reality of this resistance, this reality of this liberation, and this reality of really taking in the scope of all of our humanity. I think that is very important, because when we're talking about lived experience, we're really talking about someone or people with the humanity that needs to be also emphasized in this work and massaged in this work in a way where it creates space where these voices are leading around these issues, but also building up what it looks like around the retention, around being able to meet the mark, and like I said, in every effort of supporting the social well-being. So with that, we'll go to the next slide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Will. That was amazing. Okay. So this slide, it talks about reunification as a healing center practice. So according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation 2020, 82% of successful youth reintegration cases were those that incorporated cross-system collaboration, such as education, mental health, and family services, focused on healing rather than punishment. Systems theory by Bertolini, 1960, asserts that social problems like youth justice involvement are not isolated, but are the result of interactions across multiple systems like education, family, justice, mental health. Effective interventions require a holistic approach that addresses these interconnected systems. So just speaking from my personal experience, upon reintegration back into my community, it was critical and very important that I had already had existing relationships in the community, because when I returned, I'm pretty sure many of you may have heard of Department of Corrections. When I was released back into the community, if I didn't have a permanent address, then that could have resulted in me going back to prison, right? But because I had relationships existing in some of the community organizations that have been around as long as I've been alive, such as like Polcan, if I didn't have relationships that had already existed there, and I wasn't comfortable going and talking to some of the folks that work there, 9 times out of 10, I probably would have had got sent back because I didn't have the resources, I didn't have the tools, I didn't have the know-how. None of these programs existed. It was literally me being vulnerable, going to community folks that watched me grow up, knew some of my story and knew my situation enough to know, hey, you know what, just give us a couple moments. We're going to make some phone calls. They pull some strings for me. And by the grace of God, I had an address within the next couple of days. But had I not had those connections or those relationships in the community like that, it could have ended very differently. I'm going to take you to the next slide. Policy recommendations, Will.
Thank you for that. And also just highlight, when it comes to folks with lived experience, it oftentimes becomes the requirement for someone with a particular maybe experience to repeat, what they went through, a particular trauma. And that's taxing on anyone, right? To always have to relive a traumatizing, experience or something that didn't just necessarily fit well, even though it may have been necessary to help some of those adjustments being made. But I think about that oftentimes when we professionalize our historical, and even current trauma. That says a lot about our society, and that's one of the things with a lived experience lens that I come into this work when we do certain trainings and we talk about advocacy for increased funding and supporting workers with lived experience. The reality is, how do we get ourselves into a space where we're not reducing our talents down to our trauma? Right. It's, I think about that, of course, you want folks who are most harmed to lead these issues, but oftentimes that is not the case. They may be utilized as a piece on the chessboard that moves certain departments and certain agencies forward, but it doesn't necessarily move that person or their community forward. Oftentimes I look at it like maybe being like a basketball or football team in terms of professional sports, where you kind of get capsized, right? How many people can play, how much money you have, how many resources, and then you kind of divvy it out. So that's kind of like the lane that this particular work that should be a staple in most agencies when we're talking about shoring up the safety and security of our society as a whole, and implementing a practice that really says we care, right? But the reality is, when you kind of capsize through funding different streams, you say, here go $300,000 to try to erase this historical trauma, right? Put Band-Aid on this cancer, and you guys are, need to respond to it as if you are the creators of this particular cancer. And the reality is, oftentimes our communities, meaning our resources, whether it comes to policy recommendations, whether it comes to access to training, it gets slim to none, right? You cannot activate something that is not thoroughly vetted and it's not thoroughly resourced in a way where it can be supportive to what the bigger cause is. And with that being stated, oftentimes this particular work gets reduced to the very bottom, right? But we know when we zoom in and we click in, the data point, the foundational aspect of the work is created off of a particular category or population of people who oftentimes would not receive those resources or those services. So people with lived experience, for example, like myself, I hear young people say, unfortunately, right? I hear them talk about them being on demon time, right? That means that they're upset, they're mad, whatever, how you want to interpret that. We know it doesn't mean anything good. But for someone from a perspective who doesn't have a value lens from lived experience, will see that and be like, I'm afraid of that. Some young person showing up in that particular way. But someone with lived experience, and I often have to quote Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Her and I share one of the same mentors with Dr. Edward Nichols. And I remember her saying that, oftentimes the truth will be hidden in plain sight. So even when you look at movies and somebody has a possession so-called of a demon, they'll bring someone who was spiritually equipped into that particular space to exercise that demon. So it takes someone with a value lens to understand. When I hear a young person say they're on demon time, I'm like, oh, you have a spiritual compass, right? You have some type of morality that I can actually tap into, because you actually have awareness that spirituality in these particular aspects do exist. But someone with a lived experience can understand that. They can step into that space. They can hold that space with that young person. But also going back to how important this work is, and we're talking about funding and policy recommendations and advocacy for increased the hiccup that I see in this work oftentimes, like I said, is like going back to the professional sports theory, you get capsized. You know, how many people can do this particular work, what it looks like, and then it comes to a perspective of exclusiveness of if you've been touched by this particular practice around trauma, then all of a sudden you're qualified to lead this work. But folks with lived experience will tell you those are not the qualifiers. Just because you came up against, you know, a certain impact does not mean you are qualified to put your hands in the lives of some of our most vulnerable people, right? You also need to have your hands sanitized, which means we need to have you trained properly. We need you to understand that vicarious trauma does exist. We need you to understand that you cannot reduce your talents to your trauma specifically. We need you to understand that this work is capsized, meaning it's like being on a professional team. So therefore, the practice of nonprofit complex industrialized industry says, okay, 300,000, we can capsize maybe 60 or 70,000 of who gets work. The reality is now we're telling you how much your trauma costs and how much you can do instead of actually allowing us to see our humanity in a much different scope. And that's what lived experience allows us to do. When I was doing time as a 13-year-old, I was the youngest in the state of Washington to be tried as an adult. And I went to prison at 13 and I didn't get out till I was 33. It wasn't folks who had the qualified, you know, certifications on their wall that had the most impact on my life, right? That means by the time I went to prison, I was in the Seattle public school system. I had folks with various degrees that came across me that didn't have the impact, right? That means I came up against the juvenile justice system, the probation counselors, whatever the certification, whatever, it was not what was needed for someone like myself. And so the industry of practice needs to understand the value lens that folks bring into this space. Being able to allow us to see our humanity is first not getting caught up in the trauma itself and allowing the talent to be reduced exclusively to that particular aspect of your existence, right? And so when we talk about you getting in touch with your humanity, now we can't capsize your trauma because we're not operating exclusively through that. What we're operating from is looking at your humanity. So when we talk to young people, we want them to explore about what it means to potentially be a botanist, right? What it potentially means to be a dermatologist, because these things will never go away as long as we have human beings and other folks in existence. We need these things as a resource. We need these things as a service. But if one is only exclusively operating for their trauma, they're only operating from a perspective of survival, right? So they cannot think about things that are ingenuitive. They cannot think about things that are progressively moving the work forward because you're operating out of this trauma where your amygdala, we know these things on a psychological level, which is the part of your brain that is stimulated when you're in this fight, flight, or fear, right? And so when you have your amygdala, your cortisol levels are always constantly going up. You're always operating out of that. And then we professionalize it. We professionalize the trauma that certain marginalized folks go through, and then we capsize and say, you know, this is how much it's going to cost. So when we talk about advocacy and policy recommendations, we want folks who are close and proximate to the issue to be laying out what those things can look like, and also making sure that we're at the bare minimum, we really want to tap into everyone's humanity. Everyone's humanity. My humanity is wrapped into yours. If you can't see your liberation and my liberation, then there's no way that we can be liberated. You know, it takes all of us, and it's not an exclusive aspect of just one particular group or one particular population with a certain experience just to be operating out of that. So with that, I'm going to leave you guys with a few things around the statistics and some other different little fun facts. So the Center for American Progress in 2021 reports found that a 10% increase in funding for community-based support services reduced recidivism rates by 25% among justice-involved youth and young adults. Once again, those who are close and proximate bring a value perspective of resistance and liberation and being able to have the young folks to see their humanity. Oftentimes, but I'm conscious of this as well, I have young folks who maybe never been able to see themselves as anything outside of probably athletics, right? I'm talking about young Black men who are vigor, who got a lot of energy, Go to Garfield, go to Rainier Beach, go to Franklin. They've been told this lie. We took the placebo. You know, you can make it to the NBA, you can make it to the NFL, and it becomes that much more realistic when you got people approximate to you who actually are making it. But the reality is, once again, it's capsized, right? There's only a 54-man roster on each team in the NFL, and there's 36 teams. So you do the math. I think the math was like 1728 as far as the NFL employment, and that's almost the size of Garfield High School. So you got the entire world as far as young Black men trying to activate who they are in terms of the value into this particular space. And one of the things I get them to see is, I want you to see yourself beyond just what your gift is right now. I want you to tie your gift into your purpose. And so oftentimes when they don't make it in that sector, and they might find themselves in other different aspects, they'll look to folks like myself and say, oh, you know what? That's something that I want to do. I want to get older and I want to do that particular work. And I have to press pause on that. And I'm saying no, because this work came out of a particular lens that is hyper, pumped up around trauma. And I don't want you to have to go through things in order to have to live this particular version of the work. I want you to be able to see yourself in something much more different. And I want you to be more effective to our community versus providing the resources that requires some type of access to some kind of public funding, right? And the reality is, these are the things that with lived experience we can speak into. Most folks who are just proximate but haven't really went through certain things, they'd be like, oh, that's great. I want you to aspire to do this and take over this nonprofit and do a certain, but the reality is I want you to be tapped into your humanity. I don't want you to always be looking through the lens of how do we rectify a problem when you are already the solution to whatever it is if you activate who you are. So we talk about the social capital theory. That also emphasizes that individuals gain access to resources and opportunities through social networks. So this is Bordeaux in 1986 came up with this breakdown. Investing in community workers with lived experience help build the social capital needed to break cycles of recidivism and empower communities. We know this to be true. Those who are proximate, those who are close, only a spider can repair a spider web. Just to keep it simple. That's one of the old Khmer or Cambodian proverbs, that only a spider can repair a spider web. And then we'll go into this last slide, which is the call to action. And I'll give you, like I said, some fun facts on top of it, where the research shows that increasing funding for peer support programs for workers with lived experience can reduce community violence and improve reintegration outcomes by 40%. This was coming out of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in 2021. And the theory around transformative justice theory proposes that healing and safety come from community-based approaches that address harm, root causes, and restoration rather than punishment. The community worker's role in this process is essential, but they need adequate support and resources to succeed. I think it's pretty clear as to why. There's resources that are needed, those who are proximate to the problem, who can bring a lived experience to be able to tell the tale of a story that only that community can tell, but also highlighting our humanity. I say that not lightly, because when I work with young folks, just being, like I said, I'm a real person, being authentic, young folks, and sometimes coming from even from the community, I'm proximate to the folks who are experiencing the pain as well. And so I have a young nephew last year, or actually earlier this year, it wasn't last year, it was earlier this year, 21, 22, coming out of the dispensary. Like there's some people in the parking lot, oftentimes if they're, these are places that they will watch, whether they're going to go in and probably rob because they know that there's money, there's cash, because of dispensaries, they only deal with cash for the most part. Or folks who are coming in or coming out, they know that they got cash on them to go, frequent these places. So my nephew was coming, I think going in or coming out, and he was accosted by two or three gentlemen, and he didn't know who they were, right? And he's permitted, he has a concealed weapons permit and everything of that nature. But anyhow, they moved in a way where they was trying to rob him or something, and he was shot, right? He was shot like underneath his armpit, went through the side, by the blessings of God, he lived, right? He survived, right? And I was one of the folks that was there talking to him. But I bring this story up because I'm talking about humanity, right? Because it impacts the entire aspect when we have folks who are proximate, who can bring lived experience, who can bring, when we're talking about looking at the fullness of someone's humanity. So my nephew, like I said, he's a young African American, black boy, black man or whatever. He was shot once, single time underneath his arm, and he said he had a big jacket on. And he said when the police arrived, the first thing they was asking him was, "What gang are you from?" They're like, like they wasn't even concerned about his injuries. They was asking him what gang he was from. Like they was asking him all the wrong questions that had anything to do with his humanity. And that's the reality, is when we're talking about folks who have a vested interest in the work and being able to have a shared nexus around our humanity, that when we have issues that are impacting those who are most marginalized in the sense of a certain type of violence, and we're talking about gun violence in this particular instance, you need to have folks who are impacted from that, who can lead these issues, but oftentimes we have resources that have everybody else leading these issues, and you have young black men whose fullness of their humanity can't even be seen when they need it the most, right? And that's the part of having lived experience, being able to have increased funding to go into these spaces with the shared nexus around public safety and what that looks like, even with police agencies. How do we go in and we train them without the proper resources, without proper policy recommendations, because they are part of the social welfare of public health? Then we need to have a cross nexus where folks can be training them. They could be cross collaborations, cross system collaborations. It could be different forms of advocacy. So they're the fullness of folks' humanity when they need resources, when they need services, especially in moments like that, that their humanity can be seen. So that's when we talk about different calls of action, how we can have different impacts on different systems where it's needed the most. And last but not least, like I said, just looking at folks who are proximate. I just want to highlight folks who have been proximate to, like even in the public health lens, the medical world, other Black folks who have contributed because they were proximate. Their genius were allowed to come into the space that allowed the rest of humanity to be able to move and improve further. So things like blood banks by Dr. Charles Drew in 1940. Dr. Drew is a pioneer African-American physician, and he's a surgeon. He revolutionized the storage and the preservation of blood plasma. These are things that we need. But if you don't bring that genius into the space, you don't get this, and we don't move our humanity and the sacredness of our humanity forward. Portable X-ray machines. This is Dr. Frederick McKinley Jones, 1940s once again. Jones is best known for his refrigeration techniques. He also developed a portable X-ray machine, which was crucial for use in combat zones and rural medical environments. So think about these contributions that most folks are not telling you that helps us to be able to move our lives forward. The blue baby surgery by Dr. Vivian Thomas, 1944. Dr. Thomas, a Black surgical technician, developed a pioneering technique for treating blue baby syndrome, a congenital heart defect, right? This is about the humanity. So when people are closest or proximate to those things, we have to have a vested interest in folks' humanity. And that's what we're talking about. The HapMap project in 2002. Dr. Charles Rotimi, a genetic epidemiologist, co-led the development of the HapMap project, which maps human genetic variation. His work focused on understanding genetic factors that influence diseases like hypertension and diabetes, particularly in African populations, right? And that tells a story about itself. If you guys have never read this book, I think it's called The Universal Color Blindness, I believe, by him. Man, I apologize. I'll look it up. I'll get that information to you guys. But it's a real good read because it talks about Dr. Edwin Nichols on epigenetics, the impacts of having the African phenotype here in America, where they was talking about hypertension not even existing in African or folks who have the African phenotype in their history until they get here to America, right? All of a sudden, there's infant mortality spikes, increases in folks who come from Cuba, who come from Africa, hypertension, diabetes that never existed, but all of a sudden when they get here to America. So they know that there's something going on, right? That's so. But you don't have that information if you're not empowered that information with the folks who are proximate who can bring these issues. So if there's one population of a sick, and that's a threat to all of our humanity, right? And then last but not least, the automatic surgical scrub device by Dr. John H. Hopps in 1980s. Hopps was a physicist who helped design the first pacemaker, but he also developed an automatic surgical scrub device This invention helped improve hygiene standards in hospitals, an issue particularly critical in facilities with fewer resources, often serving marginalized communities. So we know that this is very critical. If you're not close, like I said, once again, it's hard to be able to get these things into the spaces. And this is one of the things I want to leave off on when we talk about the hospitalization component or just public health issue. In the early concept of hospitals, there was an issue around why these babies that were born very perfectly in good health were maybe hours, even days later, their lives were expiring. And they couldn't understand until they did the research and realized that the same doctors that were working with the cadavers, the dead bodies in the morgue, were working with in a maternity ward. They were working in the delivery, in the nursery. But what happened? There was a cross contamination. These doctors were not washing their hands, right? It was just a simple thing of cross contamination. And this is what we're talking about: building up this workforce and strengthening this workforce with the proper training, with the proper set of eyes. That becomes the proper sanitation. Because if not, we're going to have cross contamination, and we're going to be doing one particular work, and we're going to be serving one particular agency, and we're going to do some cross contamination if we don't have the right people in the space. And we're going to continue to keep seeing the data showing what it shows, and then folks are utilizing that data to increase their dollars and their dollars and their budgets, but it's not making real sense in terms of true time of what's taking place with folks on the ground, with folks who need support, and they need it at an urgent rate. So with that, we bring my part to this this wonderful opportunity to an end. And thank you. My name is Willard Jimerson, and I am the Executive Director of United Better Thinking. And the information is provided here, and I'll hand it over to my co-collaborator, Ebony.
Wow, thank you so much. I hope you guys received that treat. Gave you guys a heads up. You guys are in for a good treat. And well, thank you so much for always bringing all you have and producing it all with love and facts. Really appreciate it. It just kind of goes into the reality of where lived experience does not give us the credentials by osmosis. Just because we went through the system doesn't mean we have all the tools and resources necessary upon reunification. It is important to make sure that folks are taking into account the emotional labor that goes into doing this kind of work. We need tools, we need therapy, we need resources, we need education in order to be a better person. Oftentimes I've seen that a lot of people come in doing this work and they have their mind made up that they really want to help and they want to contribute to their community. But the reality is, if they don't take time to stop and look in the mirror and do the work on themselves first, oftentimes we can harm our young people and community because we're coming from a trauma-led response instead of actually giving the help and support that we truly desire. But it's just a matter of taking the time and doing the work on ourselves and really being an advocate for ourselves. We need this, we need that, I need more education. I need constant therapy doing this work, because those vicarious traumas that Will talked about earlier is so real that I have to make sure that I'm being very intentional about not letting those things build up just because of I have conditioned or trained myself over time to know how to push through something. I don't have time to grieve. I have to push through. I have to go to work. I have bills to pay. I have all these different reasons why I can't experience the emotion or the process that something yields. Yes, I've survived through a lot of things and I'm still here, and it's a blessing. But I'm in a place now where I get to say, what about the parts of me that were stuck in those traumas? I want to go back and go be intentional of loving and wrapping my arms around the little girl in me who was stuck back when that trauma happened and didn't survive through that trauma. The rest of me moved forward, but what parts of me was stuck, right? So just being very honest and real about all the things, all these things. So again, thank you so much, Will. I appreciate you all the time. I always look forward to doing work with you, having conversations with you, because they're always real, but they're always depth. This brother is a research guru. And with that, we can go ahead and open up for questions. Crystal, I'm gonna tap you in. I can't see the chat and things like that, so.
Yes, thank you. I see somebody's hand raised, but I don't see any questions in the chat, but I'll monitor that. Yeah, and it looks like Jamila. Excuse me if I'm saying your name incorrectly. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and come up
Yes,
here.
it's Jamila. I was
You went
sorry,
off
I
mute.
went back on mute. Yeah, that was three areas that should be the area of focus when dealing with these people. I think it was like the root of the cause, mental health, and there was one other area. If this if Mr. Will could kind of elaborate on where should families focus?
Um, yeah, there's a lot of root causes. That's one of the things that we really try to look at more, is not try to just focus on the symptoms. I think we try to do both and it's terms of the strategy. Um, and what you really want to do is you want to bring your strongest folks into whatever that space is, whether if it's mental health support. One of the things we're talking about around mental health support, I'm connected with some folks on the East Coast, right? This is brother named Seaton Davis and another brother named Toby Sanders that's out in New Jersey. And Seaton and what they did, they collaborated. Seaton Davis does like mental health, right? He focused exclusively on support of mental health practices and things of that nature, even providing exclusive mental health therapeutic supports for credible messengers in their community. And then what Toby did, which I really like, what Toby Sanders did, he took the concept and he brought it and he localized it, right? He went and researched the folks who were historically tied to the practice and the work in those folks' communities that they didn't even know about, right? And so that's one of the things that we do, and that's what one of the things we're doing as well here is pulling out those nexus points, but also having the strongest folks in that space. And one of the things we're talking about around mental health, so I was saying to Seaton, I'm like, okay, your positionality is almost positing folks who are doing this work exclusively, keeping them in a space where they're just always, like Ebony said, going back stuck into their trauma, right? Because like I said, when I said systematized, words that are systematized, trauma informed, you put that in the search engine, a lot of stuff is coming up, right? So we know those are funded words. So you got to already now start questioning, what's going on with this word? What's going on with trauma? What's going on with mental health? What's going on with these things? Once you can attach a dollar value to these things, we know that they're now at risk. They've been at risk. So we have to really do a lot of work to unpack that. So going back to Seaton, I'm like someone who's proximate to the issue, but who was not impacted, is different, right? Because now you have this Black brother who's from DC, but his best friend was, he said, murdered through gun violence, but he didn't come through that lifestyle. And so now he's providing mental health services for credible messengers who may have been through that. And so I'm like, okay, so where did you get to the point where you see them as more or less as a resource that keeps you in position, but you see them as a byproduct that can now acquiesce these services to other folks in their community. So what we're working on now is getting folks with lived experience, some type of certification to be able to be mental health therapist supports. Because I go back, like I said, I went to prison at 13. Literally, I was tried as an adult like 6 weeks after turning 13, right? And the reality is, I looked at it. I remember I was at Monroe Correctional Complex, and I was on my way home. It was probably like 2011, and I can remember part of my job. I worked in the chow hall, and so part of my job was to dump all the food and stuff that was left over. So they had these big old garbage pails, and you have to be very strong to pick these things up. And it took everybody, two guys, whatever, we have to put them up on these things, and it would dump them in this big canister, and it was all this slop. And I didn't realize it, right? What I was doing, so I was like, why are we always dumping all this slop into these big old canisters? I'm talking about all this food that was left over from, breakfast and lunch, and they'll throw it away. And it was like, well, because down the street there's a farm, and we pay, they pay us for our stuff to feed their pigs and everything. And I was like, wow. And I'm sitting there for doing this, and I looked at all the things in life, and I said, dirt is reused. They reuse dirt. They're able to take what we didn't use and compost it and send it down the street. And I was like, this system, like Ebony said, the Department of Corrections is not doing that. It's not correcting anything, right? But it was the men in there who seen value in me. And so I thought about it, I was like, the system don't even see me as a resource. I'm not even recyclable. Like they was able to recycle everything around me except for me as a human. So I had to tap into the energy that was around me, which made me realize that that's where my therapy came from. It wasn't somebody that was with these credentials. It was Dawood who did 9 years on death row, who did 55 years and came home and was able to tell me, man up, put some energy in me. He seen an opportunity where he might have defaulted out of life and he was able to push the reset button when he came in contact with me, him and brother Amir and all these other different folks. So when we talk about mental health, how do we get the right engineering into the space? How do we get the right people into the space? How do we lead it? We're talking about family reunification. These particular things have to be caucus around individuals who are proximate to that issue, who are closer to the problem, but they also have a solution, but they're furthest removed from the resources. How do we get them resourced? How do we get them in spaces where they're training, where these words are systematized, to give them a different lens, to provide a different view, to provide a different perspective? Because if not, we're just going to get caught up in this conundrum as we are, and it's just going to continue to keep getting funded. And we know if a thing is getting funded, it's budgeted, and therefore it's not. And I tell people all the time, your budget is your moral document. It lets us know what you care about. And the reality is, when we are able to budget our trauma, we know that they really don't care. So we need to make sure that we have the right folks in space, being able to lift those things up. Hopefully I was able to answer your question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. There's one in the chat that includes some context as well. I don't want to butcher any more names, so I'm gonna use initials in the chat that I see, but initials DH says, I am a new organization, Community Roots, Holistic Killing, and focus on justice impacted youth and their families to create an intentional community to build up our young people by supporting the entire family unit. Question. What mentors do you recommend we connect with to ensure we are fully integrating cultural identities into our program?
Do you want to take this, Ebony? Are you on me? It don't matter.
Sure, I could add something. Feel free to add when I'm done. I would say it's important to tap into your community. What is the demographic that you support? For me growing up, it was helpful for me to see someone that looked like me, even had similar experience in the same community as me. I was more inclined to listen to them through their lived experience, and how they can relate to me, as like Will spoke about the humanity, seeing my humanity, versus someone who had degrees and all these different books and no lived experience, but through certification and education, they felt qualified to be able to tell me how to be better or how to be a better me and things like that. So I would definitely say tap into your community, the young people that that you are aiming to support. What I used to do, and I still do when it's talking about providing support and resources, oftentimes I experience folks making decisions about us without us. So I always like to pull the young folks into space, let center their voice, and always let them know that, this is your program. I'm just here to support. What do you want? What does it look like for you? And ask them questions where you're highlighting what makes sense to them, highlighting their voice, letting them know that you're not just a part of a program, but this is about you. It's not just a system. It's not just anything except for you're the focus, and we're just here to walk alongside you. Will, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I want Crystal. Can you read that question one more time?
Yes. Do you want it with the context or just the question?
Yeah, you can do the context. Yeah, you can provide that.
Okay, yeah. They're a new organization, Community Roots, Holistic Killing, and focus on justice impacted youth and their families to create an intentional community to build up our young people by supporting the entire family unit. The question was, what mentors do you recommend we connect with to ensure we are fully integrating cultural identities into our program,
Yeah, I think Ebony did a great job in answering that and just emphasizing on some of the things and the value points that were lifted. Is this? I'm a real person, so I always ask: is this a space to be real? You know, I want to know if this is a space to be real because we're here to improve, and we know that. To be honest with you, always been told that, you know, it's not great ideas that work; it's people that do. So it's how we share those ideas is what we do as a connective nexus. And when I hear that breakdown, a part of me is like, okay, like Ebony said, who is also informing that lens? Who is leading in on that lens? That breakdown that was provided around a holistic healing with impacted families, it sounds to me very systematized, right? You can put that information into a search engine and it'll give you a plethora of stuff that you can copy paste and put down. But the reality is you can't copy paste real folks, right? So, and I'm not saying that's what happened. And I'm just saying how it sounds to me. If I was a young person listening to that, I'm saying, does that sound like something that is our family that is impacted by that various issue or those conditions? And I also let people know the devil is always hiding himself in the details. So if I can't understand it, I'm like, something up here may be attached to a system that is benefiting the one who is structuring the language, but how is that being transferred over into a transformational practice? So as Ebony highlighted, the folks that are impacted with your community that you're working on, how are they leaning in, you know, on the questions, on the issues, on the value perspective that you're, because what we don't want to do is get caught up in trying to be a savior. You know, oftentimes we keep putting these capes on, we're trying to save everyone and make ourselves feel better, feel good, which is great. We do want to add a value to our lives and to the lives of others. But if we're not really doing it with the true intentionality of having a deepened sense of practice around that, then we're actually harming. Once again, we're not sanitizing our hands thoroughly. We're not vetting ourselves thoroughly. We're not questioning what our intentionality is thoroughly, right? And so those are just the things that I'm thinking about just quick that came to me is like if I was a young person or if I was a person from that community or impacted from that population, how does what you just laid out actually sounds to me? You know, does it sound like that's something that can hold space for me that I can identify with? And I'm only one person, but I'm just speaking through my lens and just saying always be real, be authentic. Don't get caught up in the narrative of what the system always wants, but know that the system comprises of people. And so we have to be able to tap in with those folks. And so part of tapping in with those individuals, as Ebony highlighted, is tapping in whatever around this issue to those who are funders, philanthropists who can help to support to move the issue forward. But if not, you're just moving your agenda forward. You're just doing your thing. You sound like you're on top of whatever you want. You're about to get your dollars off the data that highlights the most marginalized, the most impacted around this issue because it sounds good and it sounds sweet. And that's what's happening with most folks. And I'm just telling you the reality. But if you really want to have the impact that you're looking for, have those who are most impacted, most situated and connected to the issue, leading that issue, and bringing valuable insight on those issues.
Thank you, Will and Ebony, and thank you for the questions that we've gotten so far. Is there anyone else that would like to come off? Oh, actually, there is another question in the chat. Uh, Monique shared that your comment, Will, your comment of copy and paste resonates. With Monique, how can organizations not fall into a system narrative but be competitive in order to receive funding?
But that's the reality. We shouldn't have to be competitive. If we're talking about, you know, elevating folks' humanity, it's no different than the practice around, let's say, I think it was 1969 when the Criminal Act was put in place, right? And alongside social services programs, right, alongside police agencies, right? And so I just want to give you a quick synopsis, real quick. So what happened? A lot of folks were even mad at the Black Caucus, right? Because they helped to sign, they promoted this bill. The bill went through, but the reason why they promoted this bill because it elevated social service programs. That's when you start to see the emergence of, you know, teen centers and community centers start to come up in a community and different organizations and nonprofit standards. But what happened alongside that social engineering programming around nonprofits and police agencies, You had a burgeoning practice that stays in place around how you build out these particular police agencies or law enforcement agencies, right? They might start it out with CIA or the FBI. They don't go anywhere. Once they get these departments going, the gang unit task force, all of these different programs, and they also can qualify for community intervention programming funding as well. So when we talk about competitive programming, those things, police agencies actually get the opportunity of being budgeted into their federal, state budget, but they also get an opportunity to go for different programming to get certain programs in their department's resource. And what I'm saying is you'll see the practice of creating this industry that stays relevant, while on the other hand, some of these community centers no longer exist. A lot of these organizations, they come and go. And this has been a standardized practice. What we have to do is we have to separate the two, because they have two different entities. We just seen the data points. That's the reason why I like to use the data. If the data shows 60% of recidivism rate is being impacted by folks with lived experience, then that lets us know that we need to invest more into that particular space versus not investing into those spaces. And so when you talk about the competitiveness, it shouldn't be there. First and foremost, we should dismember, divorce those practices where the social programming and crime kind of goes hand in hand. That's why you see the relationship between nonprofits and prosecutors or the juvenile justice system becomes like I said, a data grabbing point. For example, let me give you guys an example. Let's say an organization is working with young people, as stated, to do this intervention work. And then they get a contract, let's say with King County Prosecuting Attorney, juvenile, or they get a contract with, let's say, with Seattle Public Schools. What happens now is they're both playing off of each other. The court gets to say, we get to refer this young person to this credible organization that we pretty much sponsor. We bought and paid for you guys. Because don't forget, you work for who pays you. So the reality is, if this is a contract, you're intervention work, and you're not the person who's do that, than a crack killer. The reality is, it becomes an easy handoff for low-hanging fruit to say, okay, let's refer these young people into this standardized industry of practice that may not have the right qualities for the young person. Right? What I mean by that, let's say, for example, you use a terminology mentor, and you say somebody who's been proximate or impacted, and you say, well, we're going to use that person because they have lived experience as the suitable connecting point for this young person that we're going to refer them into the program. But the reality is that young person might be a young person that individual who's running that program cannot connect to. What I mean by that is they probably have lived experience, but they probably don't have it in a way that that young person needs that support. So it becomes an easy handoff for each system to do that. The same thing with the school. They'll say, here go our troubled youth, and we can write them off as far as those who are got IEPs, individualized education plans, or they're on 504s, which is, special education or something. They're supposed to receive at least about $10 more thousand worth of support. So if we just enroll them into these programs, it looks like we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, but the reality is we're just low-hanging fruit. So if we want to really be in the nature of helping and supporting, we need to really have those who are, like I said, always who are connected, and don't want to be a copy paste. A lot of these organizations are copy paste. I'm not saying that to cause any shade or anything, but the reality is, if it's funded, trust me, if you use the word Nike, use the word Sprite, those are funded words. They come with a cost. They got dollars attached to those words. So it's the same thing with trauma-informed care. It's the same thing with reentry. They have actually departments and dollars attached to it. So you have to be thinking, who's really attached to the reality of these budgets? Why is it moving the way it's moving? And who do we need to have in these spaces to ensure that the proper thing is being taken care of in a way that we're not being competitive around how we're supporting our community? And last but not least, I just call folks a new kind of public health worker. So the reality is, if we're talking about public health, we're talking about public safety, then we have to do a better job of getting the public into those spaces. And how do we adequately do that? Is by making sure that they're resourced, they're trained up, and we're pulling folks into those spaces who deserve to be in those spaces, who can bring a quality of insight and care. So I mean, I hope I was able to answer your question. I know it was in a long roundabout way, but we shouldn't be competitive around funding, and we should be authentic around our principles and our purpose. And if your language is just exclusively tied to funding and budgeting, um, yeah, you're just a co-conspirator. I have to be honest, and I've been that co-conspirator. I've taken a placebo. There's times I didn't notice it, and that's one thing about growth. You can be very, that's just, you just got to be honest with yourself. And you have to be honest with the reality of the circumstances are, not just these incubated moments that you may have with your team or in a department, but the reality of what's taking place in society. Yeah, I tell people all the time, you do community events and all you see is tents go up and community providers. Where's the community at? Because those are funded events. You see the banners, those that said King County and everything else on it. So the reality is, if we really want people to be leading in those spaces, we really have to have the public back into those spaces and thoroughly educated so they can be, and through that education, they'll be vetting themselves. Again, I hope I was able to answer your question.
There was a thank you for the depth of your response in the chat, so I think you did answer the question, Will. Ebony, did you want to respond to that question, or should I go to the next one?
No, I think he he covered it thoroughly through and through.
Okay, the next question is, when did the problems or issues that we are being confronted with today birth? Is it a systemic approach that was instituted into our communities some years back, and now what we are experiencing are the direct effects of those detrimental policies? So going back to the root or onset, I think it's meant to say, will there be a starting point?
I'm
Okay.
gonna let you have this one, Ebony. You can
Can
take
you
it.
repeat that, please?
Yes. Yeah, I'm gonna leave the last part out. Dr. Innocent, if you don't mind clarifying the last part of that. Sorry about that. But the question is, when did the problems or issues that we are being confronted with today birth? Is it a systemic approach that was instituted into our community some years back, and now what we are experiencing are the direct effects of those detrimental policies?
Okay, thank you for that. Honestly, if everything is modernized, right? So when we talk about slavery, for example, mass incarceration was just a modern day way of implementing and still playing around with the Constitution and all those things. It's just modern day slavery, the mass incarceration. Then mass incarceration, the way that they do it, they target the communities. Even when there's like a war on drugs, the drugs that came into our communities were not from the plug going to anywhere and going to get it. It was put into our communities. So we talk about when it is start, systems in government have plans 30 years out. I'm seeing results of things that were talked about when I was a kid, sitting and listening to my grandma or grandpa having these conversations. And now the result, I'm actually living 30 some odd years into their plans. So they're methodically planned out decades ahead of time. So the things that we're experiencing now, I remember growing up in the Central District of Seattle, there were zoning laws as far as you couldn't build past a certain height, right? So there was houses, apartment complexes can only be so tall, blah, blah, blah. Now those zoning laws have changed. There's sky rises all over the place, but this was a part of their plan. Red taping, redlining, all those type of things to just marginalize us, to get us to gentrify. All those type of things were that it was planned out. Growing up in the Central District, it's a beautiful community. We're close to the water, it's rich soil, but then it was made to, it's the ghetto, it's unattractive, it's flooded by drugs, all these different type of stereotypes to make it unappealing. So now it's been gentrified. The same park that I grew up at, it was just a regular park with a basketball court and things like that. That same park that has been gentrified, now it has an outdoor gym because health is wealth. Health is important. Now that it's been gentrified and it's catered to a different demographic or population, they have different access to things that I have to go pay a membership to go to the gym and work out or do something creative, but it wasn't accessible for me when I was growing up at that same park because it wasn't a part of their plan, right? So these things have existed from since I was alive, for sure. It just looks creative and unique. It just looks different. Will, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your response. You actually nailed it. Um, most of the thing that I was processing, um, all that. Then the question is now, I think the last question was, where do we go to try to rectify or make amend from what is going on? Let me use this analogy. If you're going to DC, for example, those of you who know the direction and you miss your exit by 40 miles, and then to get back on the track going to DC, on the highway going back to DC, what do? You have to go back to 40 miles back. It's going to take time, but you still have to go back there in order to have a real direction of where you're going. So, but in this case, what we have to do is not going back, but actually going forward. And the forward is go down, come back down, not from where we are today, because if we continue from where we are today, then we are going to miss a whole lot of people and miscommunicate our intentions and our goal and objectives. So going back is schools and prison. That is where these things start. Schools, I mentioned schools because if you pay attention to kids these days, when a child is being defiant, as something that we used to do when growing up, our parents would discipline us, not kill us, but discipline us because we're still here. It was discipline. And we somehow become responsible and became good citizens of our community. But that was taken away from parents. Okay, that was taken away from parents, and then they empower the kids for some reason whatsoever, empower the kids to discuss the issues in the house, at the school, and then have this social work. I have nothing against social workers, but some of them, they were put in there not to put family together, but to disintegrate families. The worst thing that you can do to any child is to separate them from their family. That's the worst thing you can do for any child. As long as they're not in danger of being killed or anything like that, they should not do that. Your goal should be uniting this family, educating them, training them, counseling them, mentoring them to become a stronger family so that they can be able to raise their child. No one becomes a parent with training of how to be that. Everything is hands-on. So to decide what happened to a child when they were born and the struggling mom, given the situation of things, we know we have the haves and we also have the have-nots. So the rule only applies to the have-nots. And that is where we are getting in serious trouble. I have children of my own. So school is another place. So you go to school, the child act up, they say, okay, he has all kind of mental illness disorder. And before you know it, they put them on all kind of prescription that the child should not be in. A developing brain doesn't know those type of prescriptions. What it does is you target one thing, it destroys so many things. Like I said, you target one thing, but you destroy so many things, which is wrong. If some of you are probably familiar with research methodology, you do research on how prescription or a particular medication works, and then it doesn't give you 90% success. It only can give you about 65% success. The authority approving it, so it's a success, ignoring the 40% that says it can cause this over time or instantly. So there is no medication today that doesn't have thousands of side effects. And they put that disclaimer there so that you don't go to sue them. But they know the danger. So those things are the thing. Any parents I run into, they talk about their child having this. Okay, let's talk about that. But do not allow the system to put them on medication. Those medications are destroying the children. And we're talking about what's going on. I work in the prison system, of course, you all know that. I study psychology, and I'm also a conflict resolution expert. So these things are something I have worked in. I have worked in both college institutions, and I work in prison, and I also worked in the Department of Mental Health. So these areas I have vast experience and knowledge about. And I can tell you that where those things coming from. So I don't want to take too much of your time. I know that the time is lapping, so I'm going to stop here. I have a lot to give or a lot to say, but I'm going to take this pause. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. We appreciate your valued insight. Definitely appreciate it. You highlighted a lot of different things. One of the things I just want to highlight, and I'm out of here, is just you talked about social work and education. Those are systems that we know that we talked about, once again, things being systematized, whether they be triggered words, copy pasting things. One of the things we know that with the social work and education environment, there is truly not serving the well-being of all folks who are held into those spaces. And so when it comes to like mental health and those things, I'm not the expert, so I'll let people who are experts lead in that particular space. And so that's where I come from, and try to get the strongest folks in those spaces around those issues. But we also know that if we look at the data, I'm just big on just data points. We know about 89% to 90% of social work and education is ran by white women. And still in verbiage from one of my constituents and community, she was like, social work and education is basically, where it's this, she call it the WGM, which is a white girl mafia. That's where they send all the white women is to go work in social work and education, which is not a bad thing. But we talk about things being systematized, and there's a reason as to why these things have happened, even around women issues in the 1960s and 70s, why there was a push, to bring white women into the spaces around education, into social work, right? We know that even I worked for the Urban League for 5 years. I know the Urban League was so it was a social organization, but it was created, by a white woman. And we know a lot of our historically Black institutions, as far as colleges, were sponsored by white folks as well through social work. So when we really peel back and really get to see things like you're talking about, Dr. Anderson, is we really understand things from a historical lens, and we also have to understand things from their root cause and what is keeping things in practice even till today. We keep a lot of things in practice, like Joy DeGruy said, the best thing is to hide it in plain sight. So we practice a lot of things, even when we say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. We go find out where does this verbiage come from, right? Where does sun comes from the sun god, and Thursday comes from Thor, right? We understand it, then we go deeper into the practice. We know a lot of these things come from Egypt practice as well, from Imhotep, and so the root causes lets us know why things are in place and what we're doing today as a practice to keep those systems in place. And we have to oftentimes look at ourselves in order to change a lot of these practices, and wonder, like, how did this come into place in the first place? How do we get okay with this? Margaret Mead, I'm gonna leave you guys with this. She is one of our great anthropologists, right? She wrote this book, and she talked about her experience being, I believe, in Europe. She was in Europe one time, and she's very known. She was unexpected, went to this restaurant, and the host was like, "Hey, we're proud to have you here. We're great to have you here, Margaret. We didn't expect you." And she was like, "Oh, thank you." And they set her down for dinner. He was like, "We have other, fellow Americans in the house." And she was like, who's all here? And he didn't like, I don't know how many Americans. And she was like, you know what? When you, what are you serving for? It was dessert. And he said they were serving like a slice of pie or piece of cake. So she said, when you serve the dessert, let me know, and I'll tell you how many exactly Americans are in the building. And so it came down for the serving of the dessert. She walked around, she observed, she counted, and she came back to the host and said there are approximately 65 Americans here. And he went to the list and he counted, and he was like, man, how did you know that? She was like, well, just through observation and studying human and social construct and how we're influenced. She said, in America, when we eat a slice of pie or piece of cake, we eat it from the tip toward the back. But here in Europe, when you guys eat a slice of pie or piece of cake, you eat it from the back toward the tip, right? So there's a lot of things that are socially ingrained in us. So we go back and look at the root causes, we can say, why do I show up like this? I thought this was natural, but is it really natural? Is it truly natural to show up in these particular ways? So we have to, if we're talking about looking at historical root causes and understanding those symptoms, we have to look at our identifiable practices and also systemically those practices and what are leading to.
Ebony, is there anything you'd like to add on? Nope. There was one last question that may be hard to get. We need just like 2 minutes at the end, but maybe if there's one thing that you all can share is there was a question that says the fact that systemic issues exist. The question is how do we disrupt the cycles? Again, probably a hard question to answer quickly, but maybe if there's one or two things that either or both of you would like to share.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to fix that PowerPoint in a second.
No
I
worries.
would just say for me, what I do is I I do the things that impact me, and then I show up in that way. For example, I'm in the courts doing diversion work all the time, from low level survival crimes all the way to serious crimes that could be someone's full life, right? So I was impacted by this system so young. I was railroaded. The system just really did a number on me. Thank God, by the grace of God, that I was able to make it out with that spirit of advocacy, because now I see the things that I didn't see and I wasn't aware of. And then now I can show up for these young people or just my community in a way that I wish someone would have showed up for me. Or I see the necessity, the need that's there, just advocating. Because sometimes even judicial advocacy, I find myself also advocating against the public defenders that are appointed by the courts, right? So it just, for me, I show up in that way, but then also in a real way where just existing in space to cultivate a safe space where young people can just exist, bring their problems, their concerns, and things like that, just where they can be safe, be heard, and just feel like they're seen, their humanity is highlighted. So it just really depends on what speaks to you. What are you comfortable with? Because there's so many different angles that we can come from, that we can show up to dismantle these things. But it's important to know your lane and to stay in that lane, because like even for this presentation, I'm not the biggest researcher. That's not my lane. I do research, but I also know that my co-facilitator is dynamic at it. So just using that as an example, just knowing your lane, what speaks to you, and then showing up in that capacity. Well, did you have anything to add?
Thank you, Ebony. Is it okay if I chime in? Yeah, thank you. Sorry, because we do have to wrap this up. Thank you, Ebony. Thank you, Will. And thank you all for joining us today. After the session, there will be a follow-up email where a certificate of completion will be provided, a copy of the presentation, as well as the recording. So please look out for that in the next couple of days. But again, just a really, really huge thank you to Ebony and Will. Your feedback is important to us. There in the chat, you can find a link to a survey. There will also be a link sent out in the follow-up email. And then once you exit this Zoom room, you'll also, excuse me, a link to the survey will will pop up as well. So please, if you could take a few minutes to complete that survey, we'd greatly appreciate it. And also stay connected with us. And you can access all of the items on the left on our website, such as upcoming events, recordings. You could request support, publications and resources, and the newsletter. And then next week, we'll be having our final session of the Heartwork series that is connected to last week's session. So if you joined or not, please feel free to join us next Tuesday at the same time. But again, thank you so much to Ebony and Will for all of your insights, for all of your wonderful information that you all provided, and for answering the questions that folks had beautifully. Here's our contact info. And again, thank you all and hope you all have a great day.